All right, so this is Short Story Discussion Club. We are talking with the awesome Kij Johnson. And since her first sale in 1987, Kij Johnson has sold dozens of short stories to markets, including Amazing Stories, Asimov's Duelist magazine, Fantasy and Science Fiction, and Realms of Fantasy. She won the Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award for the Best Short Story of 1994 for her novelette in Asimov's Fox Magic. In 2001, in 2001, she won the International Association for the Fantastic in the Arts Crawford Award for Best New Fantasy Novelist of the Year. Her short story, The Evolution of Trickster Stories Among the Dogs of North Park After the Change, which is a great story, you should read it, was on the final ballot for the 2007 Nebula Award and the World Fantasy Award, and it was a nominee for the Sturgeon and Hugo Awards. In 2009, she won the World Fantasy Award for 26 Monkeys, also The Abyss, also an excellent story that everyone should read, which was also a finalist for the Hugo and Nebulous. She won the 2010 Nebula for Spar, and I bet you can guess what I'm going to say about that story because it's also excellent. The 2011 Nebula for Ponies, oh my God. In 2012, she won both the Nebula and the Hugo for The Man Who Bridged the Mist. And I'm going to stop there and let Kij correct me and update.
The but gosh, I did not realize that bio was that old. So yeah, since then I won a couple more World Fantasies. One for Privilege of the Happy Ending, which came out in 2019. And a lot more stories since then too. So the right by now, I think the status report is I think I have 6 books or maybe 7 books plus about 60 or 70 short stories. And in the last 2 years, I pivoted and started working in last 2 to 4 years working in tabletop role-playing games again because I was there in the 90s and it's a lot of fun, especially for somebody who's a theorist about structure, story structure. Experimenting with story structures is enormously fun, and role-playing games are a form of experimental fiction, um, which is super. So that's kind of everything. And yeah, and I teach workshops, and I'm no longer teaching at the university level, although there is a possibility I would go back to that. We'll see how that goes.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to dive right into things. I have a question here from M about Mantis Wives. And I'm sorry, now I'm looking at the wrong email. This is not the right one.
Ta-da!
So confident in what I'm doing. And then here we go. My one question for Kij, because Bowie is M and they are muted in their office. So right now. So
Sure.
question is simple. Which came first, the theme of women and men in Mantis Wives or watching Mantis Lives? In other words, were you looking for a way to express this theme, or did the natural phenomenon generate the story?
Everybody always says, what a great question. That actually is a really, really great question. I was already very interested in writing about sort of, and Spar is another example, stories about the ways that men and women are corrosive to each other, and the fact that it's interactive, that it'd be very lovely if we could just villainize men for what they do, but in many cases, women are complicit in the sort of villainization of women. And so I was very interested in this, and I was interested in exploring it in ways that are not typical, you know. So, and one of the interesting things, I've always been interested in exploring sort of animal behaviorism. And I was at a point right then when I was getting interested in insects, just generally because I didn't know anything about insects, and that's what's always driven me about when I'm writing about animals. It's generally because I got super obsessive about learning about them. I spent 2 years researching them, and then I decided, or five, depending, or 10, depending, and then I would write about them. So the answer is it was the idea of writing about men and women came first, but because I was already writing about that. The mantises came second because mantises are such an um, the conceit of the mantis that always bites the head off the male during coitus, that while that is actually somewhat problematic from a scientific level, because these female mantises are under pressure when they're under observation, and so they get anxious, and then it's quite possible they bite the heads off because of that. Although I think you could do something interesting with that in the story as well. But the mantises were this like perfect symbol. And then, as is my signature move, I then spent months researching mantises, none of which actually turns out to be directly relevant for a story where all the mantises are really just metaphorical. But I couldn't have written it without the obsessive research underlying it, sadly. So yes, no, I love that question though. So, but I would say it was in that order. Um, and I would say that often the story, especially when I'm not talking about animals that I've worked with before, then if I'm writing about something I haven't written about before, often it's because I had an idea that seems like the correct place to talk about it is
Mhm.
with this animal.
Mhm. So I have questions, but I also like to let you guys ask questions first. So I'm presuming you can either unmute and speak or hold up your hands or wave frantically or hold up certain tattoos as you're going. Um, but so if anybody has questions, I'm pausing to let you go. But otherwise, I'm going to say, so, kid, it sounds with this when a story comes to you, is it often like that or usually like that, where it's like, here's a theme and I'm going to noodle around with it and I need to find the right speculative framework for it? Or, okay.
Yeah, and actually, no. Sometimes they happen like that, but I think more often, and I think for many of us who write short fiction, it often comes from an image. So I have a specific visual in mind. Sometimes it comes from a first sentence, and especially with the shorter things like Mantis Wives. Sometimes a first sentence will drive you through 1,000 or 1,500 words without you really even having to do much thinking because that's the gift of flash fiction. I've been experimenting a bunch with flash fiction just in the last year or so, because it had been a while since I'd done flash fiction. But my preoccupation whenever I'm writing flash fiction is just how economical can you be and yet maintain and yet be able to do the move from immersion to estrangement and back. So the idea of immersion being the idea that we fall into the story, we're swept away by it. And the estrangement being the moments that we step back and we notice the prose or we notice the concepts or, the moments that we are back in our bodies and no longer just a pair of eyes attached to a brain. And so the flash fiction does the impression, the visceral impression better than anything. It's like, especially something like Mantis Wives, it's really like surreal art.
Mhm.
It's confusing and unsettling, and you can't quite put your finger on it. And then until you can, or until you say, I accept that I can't make sense of this. And I think that there is a particular kind of flash fiction, which is very much about the evocation, not about the construction of a plot. Those will often look like vignettes or they'll look like, single scene micro stories. But flash fiction can also be this, where it's a series of disturbing images which are presented to you as economically as possible, but within this framework, which forces you to engage with it in the abstract as well. Each of these tiny sections, if they were not framed as this sort of catalog of torments, tortures, would be just a very short, sharp punch that would be uncomfortable and unpleasant, quite possibly. But because they're framed in these poetic ways with these poetic titles, it forces the reader is both lured in and also unsettled. And that is what great horror does. It's also what great, it's like in a very different way what the best of comedy does, where you are both lured in, but also you're being forced out by the comedy, because now your body is reacting, your body is laughing, or your body is having a frisson, your body is like queasy or shivering or grossed out or startled or something like that. So it's most of the time it's especially with the shorter stuff, there is a core image or a core a sentence around which the entire story pivots. In this case, I did like the very first sentence, and I actually brought it here because I can't recite it from memory by any means. But uh, eventually the Mantis women discovered that killing their husbands was not inseparable from the getting of young, which to my mind was a statement you could make about pretty much a lot of things. And so that sentence, that slight formal diction, then forced the diction of the entire rest of the thing. If it had been a novella, I probably would have had to step down from that, but maybe not always.
Well, it's interesting that that eventually really carries a lot of weight in that
Mhm.
sentence to kind of give you the sense of kind of process in history and how much happened before then. That's lovely.
Yeah, that starting a story with something that forces the reader to imagine what came before is
Yeah.
always really fun. And the most economical way to do that is to say, for instance, and then she walked down the stairs as your
Mm.
first sentence. Because the and then asks a question that the reader now actually can't answer because it's outside of the frame of the story. But they are now asking questions and they'll stick with it for a while.
Deborah, you have unmuted in a way that indicates
Yes, I
you.
have.
We didn't
Uh,
count.
I was going to ask about the inspiration uh, behind. You've spoken a little bit about the titles, but they're extremely striking, and I wondered if you'd taken them from any particular culture or time.
No, this one I did not. Partly because by the time I wrote this, I was definitely interrogating my right to engage with other cultures. So I was asking a lot of questions about what do I bring? Why am I bringing it? Is it worth bringing? And I think sometimes the answer is yes, I'm a white woman writing about X, but I do have something worth saying, and so I'm going to say it. But much of the time, I will also end up saying I'm a white woman writing about why, and I don't need to. I do not bring something radical, something that will open a door in a different way. So this was right around here is when I started pivoting into thinking more about questions of my own cultural landscape. That's when I started writing about growing up in Iowa. That's when I started to write about the literature that I read because only really did that as a joke before that. But it's after that that I write The Dream Cost of Velvet Bow, which is me examining my cultural landscape. And it's like also after that that I write The Privilege of the Happy Ending, which is me investigating what is not my personal landscape, but it is my cultural landscape, the notion of 12th century England. So a lot of these, because I'm looking at it right now. So the bitter edge, the eccentric curve of his thoughts, the strength of weight, unready jewels, the oubliette, the scent of violets, two stones grind together, the desolate junkland, shame's uniformity, the paper folder, the cruel web, and how to live. These are all things that, in some cases, they actually don't have anything apparently to do with what comes afterwards. Because, especially in flash fiction, if I leave a gap, the reader fills it. We are pattern making animals. And if you read Unready Jewels, and then you read something that's apparently completely unrelated to jewels, you're desperately going to be trying to find a meaning in there. And you will find a complex meaning that is not the meaning that maybe I didn't have a meaning. In most of these cases, I did have a reason why I named them that. But there's at least one in there where I didn't. I was just like the scent of violets. They mate many times until he dies. Why is that the scent of violets? Who knows? But I thought I liked the way those two phrases went together because the scent of violet's such an abstract, we all know what smell is like the most fundamental of senses. So the scent of violets is a very relatable scent because either we've smelled it ourselves or we know somebody who wore violet perfume, somebody from our childhood. But combining that with the very austere, they mate many times until he dies, is that conflict between those two is meant to draw the reader through. Also, I wanted something super short right there because part of writing this kind of story is that you have to keep surprising people because it is a pattern story, like George Saunders says about the school. It is a pattern story. Here's a title, here's a thing. Here's a title, here's a thing. Here's a title, here's a thing. And if I don't surprise people with the content or the length or something, then they will start predicting what they think is going to come next. And that might be good. They might come up with something like when I talk about filling in gaps, they might come up with something wonderful. But if I rely on the pattern to draw them through, sooner or later, they will like something that they thought of better than something I wrote. And that's when I lose them. So once they figure out the trick, they may very well start trying to do it for themselves. Does that make sense, Deborah?
It does. Thank you.
Go ahead, Janet.
So this is the tattoo that Kat was talking about.
Bang.
I ask a lot of questions. So you were mentioning that most of all of the sections revolve around the Mantis woman discovered that killing their husbands was not inseparable from the getting of the young. So I wanted to talk a little more about the cruel web because it's the last on the last page. It's the second to last one, and it's the first time that an outside party has been brought into the relationship. And it just, I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about the spider and the role that now that plays in the
There are, and that's a very insightful observation about how the story is structured because that is entirely intentional. All of them before are about the ways that they start out with all of them being about the ways that the Mantis wives kill their husbands in ways that are making difficult arts, as I say at the beginning. Then we switch to the list of titles. Which I don't, because by now you know the pattern. I don't have to describe them. You can come up with something at least as gross or beautiful or macabre or all those things as I can. So I don't have to tell you what the ambition of aphids is because that sound is going to take you somewhere. And the section ends, there are as many arts as there are husbands and wives. So that's the moment we move into a new gate in the story. And the new gate is there are many ways that men and women interact. These are a bunch of them. I described some and now I listed some. And here's another one, the cruel web. The idea that somehow, despite your best intentions, despite their best efforts, they are trapped by their environment or by their behaviors or by themselves into the same old, same old. Just in the end, they did not choose. She did not choose to kill him. He did not choose to stay there and be killed. But the habits are strong. They are still, they're attempting to break out of the sort of bondage of their upbringing or their genetic training. And they can't. And the spider is the outside voice. And you can argue that, if you map this very directly onto humans, you can build like, oh, I see, the one where they're piercing the skin. That's the way that somebody might needle their spouse. You just keep picking and picking and they keep exposing more and more until finally they're like, I'm out. This is bullshit. So all of them, you can push really hard and say, I see how this would play out in a human relationship. And that one you could push hard and say, I see how this would work. There's somebody else involved and that somebody else is it's a threesome or it's the other woman or the other man or something that is destroying this marriage. But in fact, it's really meant to be their environment. And that's why it emphasizes the webs. It's not that the spider lured them into the webs, it's that they kept going in the same old patterns and that took them into the webs. But it was up to them. And that's why it ends the way it does. It's like she's larger than he and stronger, but they often fall together because that particular trap kills both of them. And that's why that takes us to the final moment, which is the how to live. Mantis may dream of something else. This may also be a trap. By that moment, you've seen that there are other possibilities, even if they have failed. And now is the moment that it's like you see essentially an attempt at a healthy relationship, but also the doubt because of the pattern of, failures and destructive behaviors. So, are you really doing the healthy thing, or do you just think you're doing the healthy thing? And so it was like that structure was very, very intentional. And you're right that it absolutely pivots the ending of it, having established my pattern, having lured you through with some pretty but macabre images. Now I am breaking the pattern by transcending the pattern and then reversing the pattern. And then at the very end saying, but maybe it's still the pattern.
Yeah.
So it's very much a hyper fast double take.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you. You really made me look at the pattern from a different angle. And so that was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Greg, did you have a question?
I was going to ask about that last sentence. I think you sort of already answered.
Okay.
Like, what did you mean by everything could be a trap? And I think you were already answering in a sense that because of our natures, everything can be a trap, or you can't get out of the patterns even if you want to sometimes. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that. Or maybe I'm not saying back what you said correctly.
That's pretty close, actually. So I guess what I was aiming for was the sense that it's not that our natures drive us to behave poorly, but it's that we can't always trust when we think we're behaving properly to be true because we have been wrong so many times, meaning us as humans. We have been wrong in so many ways. We have tricked ourselves and tormented other people or been tormented in so many ways that how do we know that this is the right one? How do we know that this time we're not, this is not an incredibly sophisticated, because one of them just before this is the desolate junkyard, which is the first one, desolate junkland, which is the first one that moves into human country. Because now we're talking about she brings him crosswords and pornography, she dances in veils before him. And in that one, we've moved into human country because obviously mantises don't do crosswords, is my guess. And so I'm trying to, and that's one where it looks like it should be good for him, right? Because, she's doing everything he could have dreamt of. A mantis wife may lay her husband gently upon a soft bed and bring to him cool drinks and silver dishes filled with sweetmeats. She may offer him games and pornography, may kneel at his feet and tell him stories of mantis men who were heroes, may dance in veils before him. He tears off his own legs before she begins. So that's a case where it appears that she's giving him everything he could have ever wanted. He is the one who is complicit in his destruction in this one. He is in fact, the destructor in this one. So I've already started to break that pattern, but those are but until we hit the point that I give you the list and then I reverse it, they're just foreshadowings of the change that later is going to happen in this story. Does that help at all? So yeah, this may also be a trap, is more about how the ways that we trick ourselves into believing we're doing the right thing than it is that our character, our nature drives us to do the wrong thing. Although it certainly can be read that way as well.
Deborah?
And was this story a delight to write, or was it like pulling tiny teeth?
It was, I liked it insofar as I could tell it was good, but all the way through it, I felt slightly queasy. The same way I did when I wrote Spar, actually. I couldn't actually rewrite Spar all in one sitting because it was so hard for me to write. And then it was equally harder to read it and say, okay, now let's make sure from a craft level it works. So this was a bit like that,
Mhm.
having uh, basically put all my money on this number in this roulette game, I now had to stick it out. I had to ride it, and it was very uncomfortable. The tortures, it's like the just almost, and sometimes it's almost erotic language being used to describe the torments. And it was meant to be vivid and beautiful in a way that was unavoidable, as opposed to vivid and horrifying in a way that was unavoidable, like Spar or Ponies. Ponies is not meant to be beautiful. Ponies is meant to be unavoidable. You cannot get away from this, is the statement that Ponies' prose is making.
Mhm.
So in this case, it wasn't fun, but it was interesting. And I would find myself sort of swept away by the language sometimes. And like as I went back through, like biting his legs off, like the crisp legs and things like that, those images were so weird and beautiful and awful to me that it's like I was like, okay, can I push harder on that image? Can I make it even more icky? And um, and that's why a lot of this is like just so extremely detailed. There's one, the oubliette, where the wife removes the sensory organs. And it's all described in graphic detail,
Mhm.
plucking the individual hairs, scraping the mouth out. And it's all meant to be. And when we get into that, we're starting to see going back and forth between elevated language, like excising the auditory thoracic organ, and then very crisp language, like biting free the wings. And some of that's based on how familiar I was with what a thoracic organ was. So so sometimes that narrator's voice goes from very elevated and slightly abstract to, well, the fact is she chewed off his wings. That's what it was. So, but it wasn't easy and it wasn't pleasant to write. That's maybe the reason why it's so short too, because I can see that there are other things I could have done with it, that I could have taken it farther in other directions. And like Spar, this one is 900 words. I think it was the shortest Hugo nominee in history, I think, for short fiction. But Spar is 2,400 words. It does very little more, and in fact, its pattern is the same, but it spends more time. It has an outside thing, which is like what's going on with Greg, what happened to bring her here, but it's really it just that one was in some ways not as hard to write as this, although that one was harder to reread than this one. At some point, the aesthetics of this one overwhelmed me, and I was like, okay, I can read this all the way through. I can now groom it the way I always do. So then I could go through it. But even now, like going back to it to read it, knowing that you did, I was like, you. Uh,
This story,
so
like like I think, like all of your stories, is just exquisite prose, and every detail
thank you.
works, right? There's no extraneous stuff. Um, could you talk a little bit about your editing process, bearing in mind that we are all writers who just, of course, want you to tell us the magic trick, but
Wow.
no, I just kind of like, what is your
I,
writing process, your editing
I
process
Well,
like?
as it happens, I do have a magic trick. I teach this because this is all about, and because you're all writers, it's actually, this is a conversation we can have because it's very abstract. The fact is, the reader experience is completely different than the writer experience. The reader only accesses a story in a sequential way in one direction. They start with the word once, upon, a, time, and they can guess what the next word is going to be, but they can't know until they read the next word. So the reader experience, and this is the magic that we manipulate because we stand above the entire, and I always visualize it when I'm teaching as a thin line of words that is, let's say, 6,500 words long, but it's only one word wide. And the reader's experience is that they can only access that meaning at a specific pace. The line goes by at a certain speed, and uh, and one of our things that we do is we compress when we need to keep to ratchet the tension up, or we need to keep them from getting bored. So if the line's going on like this, and then there's a whole subordinate clause which is meaningless, we just cut it out, suture them together, and now that sentence is only this long. So we've more efficiently hit our sort of what I think of as sort of the cost benefit ratio for the reader, that the reader has to have a certain amount of benefit for the cost of dedicating themselves to your story. And if you fail to give them sufficient benefit and sufficiently varied benefits, they will wander off because there's 5,000 other things for them to do. This is critical in a different way in novels, but in short fiction, because they are more likely to read it, you can actually play around a little bit more. You can actually delay like your first reward, because you can actually write a sentence that goes on and on and on, and it's not until the end of the sentence do you actually get the meaning out of it, because I'll read it. So the first part of it is that that thin line, which can only be accessed at a certain number of sort of meaning units or words per, let's say, second. They can only read, and for different people, it's different speeds. There are people who read, very fast, people who read very slow, but they're all reading consistently, except for speed readers who jump. But we're not going to talk about speed readers because those are the people I want to reach. But they are a specific challenge because what you have to do is you have to lure them into slowing down. And you do that in a whole bunch of things that you can't do as a beginner, like bearing your lead. We always say, your things for speed readers, they read the first sentence and the last sentence, and everything in between, they just pick up some nouns. And if it's sufficiently interesting, they then read it. But most of what they're doing is these two bracket this big gray field for them. And so they just jump. And my goal as a writer, and this is why I'm so precise, is that I want them to have to read every word. And so I do things like bury the lead in the middle of a paragraph so that they get to the end of the paragraph. And if I'm good enough in all the other ways, then they get to the end and they go, wait, what happened? Whoa, 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 whoa. And now they go back and they reread the paragraph because by that time they trust me as somebody who is not going to mess with them without reason. So now they will go back. And now that is obliging them to read carefully from then on out. Patrick O'Brien, who is a nautical writer and one of the best writers of the 20th century, is absolutely, he does this all the time. You're like, wait, somebody died? I missed it. And then you go back, but then you become very careful about reading Patrick O'Brien for a while after that. So that's the first lesson. But the other lesson is the perspective lesson, because we stand above the story looking down at it. Our readers are reading it this way. And that gate shift, when a dramatic turn in a story is really just a moment that the writer has said something that forces them to reevaluate everything that's come before, just as in a Hollywood show, like a really well-written TV show like Person of Interest or something like that. You get to the commercial break, and right before the commercial break, they do something that makes you say, wait, I thought that was the good guy. What we're doing is that at a very sophisticated level. We hit those turns, those dramatic turns, which force the reader to reassess. The reader then goes back and thinks, oh, what did I just read? Oh, that's right. Okay, so they aren't the good guys, they're the bad guys. Cool. Then they keep reading with that as their new assumption. But they're always trying to guess. They're always guessing what they are coming up on that they haven't seen yet. We stand above it. And we are the ones who manipulate the compression and the telescoping. We're also the ones who manipulate the turns and how we frame the turns so that when they get to one, we haven't lied to them. We just didn't tell them the one sentence that would force them to reevaluate. When I'm teaching, a lot of times I use, it's an E. Cummings line as an example, a micro example of this. Pity this busy creature, man unkind not. That is a line that as you read it, pity this busy creature, man unkind not. It has 4 turns at the end. The not that negates the entire sentence before that. Man unkind. We're expecting mankind, but what we get is an inversion, man unkind. We go from creature to man, and we go from pity this busy creature, man, unkind, not. And those turns are what we are doing on a much larger scale as fiction writers. Every time we do a turn, we're forcing them to reevaluate the rest of the sentence. And my idea of the ultimate victory as a writer is if they get to the end of a story or a book and they're like, fuck. And then they go back and they start it again because now they know what I'm doing. Now they want to see what I did. How I did it. So as we look at it from above, and this is directly to your question, is that we have to write the draft when we don't quite know what's happening until the very end. So that draft is our reader experience, except it's a creative experience. It's us going, oh, I get it. They're lovers. Cool. And we create our draft. And sometimes we do some of this in outline and sometimes we don't. But then we go back in, the way I do it is I go back in, observing it, the whole thing from above, and then picking one thing at a time that I'm going to engage with. So in Mantis Wives, for instance, I did one pass where all I was interested in was sentence lengths. Because if you want to surprise readers, you have to surprise them in different ways, because if you always go to, a run-on sentence when you're trying to make a point and you do it every single time, pretty soon they're like, they get it, they got it, they're done. Or if you go with like the dramatic turn, like the pity this busy, your sentences are structured like that, where you always invert it or not, she thought, it's like, those things become old fast. So what you end up having to do is offer rewards on all kinds of levels, so that even if somebody is not like a stylist, they will have rewards of their own. If somebody is not into the storyline, they will find rewards. If somebody doesn't care about the characters, or these are not their favorite kinds of characters, they will have rewards. And that, for me, that figuring out the rewards for all the readers, randomly scattering them on the trail so they keep looking at their feet to pick up the next shiny thing. Now, if I just threw, like quarters down, they'll pick up quarters for a while, but after a while, they're like, I'm done with quarters, and they'll walk past them. So I have to offer other incitements to keep their eyes on their feet. And that's surprises, like finding a letter if you're hiking a mountain, or finding an earring, one earring, finding a quarter, finding a foreign coin, finding, pretty much anything, finding a canteen, a dented canteen with a bullet hole in it. All of these things will force the walker to keep their feet down, or to keep their eyes on where they are going. And that's what we are doing, is that we are trying to keep their eyes on every word, because and lots of people have said this before, we want them to read every word we wrote. We made decisions, hard decisions, about our words in the order what we wanted to say, and they just want to read the good ones, but they can't know what the good ones are. So they are deciding what the good ones are based on their interests. And so we have to keep giving them new rewards. And for me, I go through multiple passes when I am thinking about, okay, so I'm a very flashy writer. I'm a very stylish writer, but there are people who hate that. So what else can I give them? What else can I do? And then I just go through and I say, at this point, looking down on this story, maybe I need to give them something a little more visceral so they reconnect, so they're back for the shiny words. Or maybe I need to give them a truth so that they're back for the shiny words. Or maybe I need to write a chapter that's one sentence long so that they don't feel like they're wasting their time. Michael Blake does this in Dances with Wolves. He has one chapter in what is a beautifully written book that is one sentence long, and it covers 2 weeks, because he could have written a whole chapter there. And I have this feeling he did write a whole chapter. And then he realized, oh, I can replace it with, for the next 2 weeks, John Dunbar cleared the abandoned fort, period, or whatever it was precisely he said. So does that answer your question, sort of? I mean, this is a craft, very much a craft group. So this is a craft answer. Rewrite, rewrite, rewrite. That's what it is for me. But not rewrite to make the words prettier or shinier or make the sentences better, because that, by now in my career, those are the easy parts. But to make sure that it's always interesting to everybody, to the best of my ability.
It makes sense to me, and this is good stuff. And I hope you notice Michelle's just talking about going back to listen to this again. And I've been jotting stuff down. It seems to me there's some overlap with what Don Moss says about microtensions, where he talks
Mhm.
about sentences having to have these spots that pull us along and keeping it
Yes.
going.
I mean, I do sometimes teach a micro writing class, and I am very interested. Right now, I'm reading Virginia Tufte's book on syntax as style,
Ooh,
where she goes through thousands of sentences from all kinds of books, and she hyper analyzes them with the exact obsessive compulsive attention that you would expect from the mother of Edward Tufte, the guy who basically invented modern sort of design principles. And it is glorious. It's a hard read. You don't sit down, you don't take it to the beach. You read a page and then you're like, well, okay, that's a lot. Because it's very dense, very densely packed, but also very informational because she does it. She has the whole thing on a chapter on the one word sentence. The idea, how do we draw them through the sentence, through the paragraph, through the scene? Scenes start to shape themselves, and so do chapters in novels. A scene, we all know it's like 500 to 1500 words, it's going to cover 3 to 5 minutes of action, probably, blah, blah, blah. We all have an idea of what a scene is because we see scenes on TV all the time. And fiction scenes are actually quite similar to scenes in other sequential media that can only be accessed in one direction.
awesome.
But the sentence, which is our magic power, our ability to build multiple meanings into the same pivot word in a sentence, for instance, that's a lot of our specific tension. And this goes back what you just said, Kat. This is exactly right. We, the reader does, there's reasons why writers like Clive Cussler were popular for a long time. And it's not because he was a particularly good writer, he was a shitty writer, and not because he was a good storyteller exactly, but he knew how to build a scene. And so you read scene, and at the end of that, you were like, okay, cool, I'll read the next one. And if it didn't make sense at the end, if they didn't all add up, it didn't matter because each scene was satisfying in and of itself. But this is a way to sort of, as we look at the micro writing, this is something that allows you to manage the reader expectation within the scene in ways beyond just the plot and character developments.
Awesome. Janet has a question.
X away.
Um, you guys can say no, but are you open to a general question about revision on a longer piece?
I am if Kat is.
Yeah, I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a novella, and my current editing process is to go through each scene and make sure it's structured properly so that it has all the elements and it flows properly. And yeah, boy, this story needs work. And is that something that you have done? Is it something that you recommend? What are your thoughts on that?
Because what I usually do is I teach novel workshops, and what I'm interested in especially is novel structure. So we don't actually look at people's manuscripts. We get them to send us 10 pages so we know what they thought the book was about. And then it's like, bring us a bullet list of the things you think are going to happen. And then for 2 weeks, that's what we do is we construct.
Interesting.
We help them construct. So we call it a workshop, and that's actually not accurate because we're not workshopping. We are workshopping in the way you do if you go to a maker space and you build furniture. What we've taken to calling ourselves, we're more interested in the blueprint of the novel or the novella than we are in the actual novel or novella. My partner, my co-writer or co-teacher, Barbara Webb, does an enormous amount of stuff online. So the answer is you do have to do that, but you also have to do all the other things. So you're right that you have to shape the larger arc, the larger arcs, because you usually have multiple things going on. You have your interpersonal relationships and your personal relationships, and you're building a larger story, and you've got a lot of plot, things, people doing things. You have action, lots of actions going on. And all of those things have to be structured properly. But the heart of any longer work becomes the scene. So, and you're right that you have to craft each scene, but you have to always be thinking that, again, the reader is ready to be bored. So every scene has to do it differently. Every scene has to offer a different reward, which is if you keep offering the same thing, like characters are given a problem, they attempt to solve the problem gets worse. Next scene, characters are dealing with the consequences of that problem, they try to solve it, the problem gets worse. That falls into churn where all you're doing is just paddling and nobody's getting anywhere. And some of that is because the plot is not advancing, but some of that is because the reader starts trying to skip ahead to the good parts. Because they're like, yeah, I know. And now you're going to go visit the blue castle, and then you're going to go to the pink castle, and then we're going to go to the purple castle, and then we'll find out the truth, you know? So they start to try to second guess us. And because they can come up with 100 guesses, but we are forced to tie ourselves down to one truth, they will almost always guess where we're going if they are intelligent readers. This is why an agent can look at something and like 3 minutes in go, yep, nope, 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 nope. Yep, this one's promising. Let's see what she does with it. The reason why is because they are the most experienced readers there are, really. But what that means is that we have to give them those micro rewards, those other things throughout it, so that even if you are just doing something really quotidian, like, oh yeah, I got to get these 3 characters in a room together and have them have a conversation. And the reader is reading it going, oh, now they have to feed the information back and forth, whatever. But that's when you add something else to the mix so that as that information is passed back and forth, something else is being passed on too. And that could be language, that could be personal interactions. A classic move in a mystery when characters have to get together and essentially a part of the plot is then repeated, is that there's a second level to what's being said, which is, how are we interacting? Are we hostile? What does this say about our characters? What does this say about our character interactions? So it's the risk, I think, and this is just general, this is not to you specifically, Janet, the risk of getting too bogged down in perfecting structure too soon is that you start to invest, and sometimes it gets harder and harder and harder to see what has to change. Like, as an example, last year at workshop, somebody brought a book outline in, and they had 2 characters that mapped almost exactly on each other. And the real answer is probably that's one character, because that's a more interesting character as soon as you put the 2 together. And if you refuse to do that for reasons, which is fair, then the answer is differentiate the characters by giving them each a different set of issues. But this person who had written way more than they had told us was really invested in those characters, because removing one of those characters would have required rewriting every single scene that had those characters. And you look at that and you just feel queasy at the prospect. It's like, I've put so much time in this. Are you telling me? Are you seriously telling me I have to rewrite 79 scenes right now? Yeah. And it's like, nobody wants to hear that, which is why we work with people who are in earlier stages in their books. In fact, we have people show up who basically have nothing but, like 2 pages of notes and a 10-page opener, and that's all they bring. So it's hard to make that shift to standing above the line instead of, because you're still tinkering it when you're working on plot, you're still kind of tinkering with it in the line. Okay, if I'm the reader, what do I see next? What do I see next? What do I see next? Instead of standing above it and saying this whole piece should go here. And that's harder to do. If you write yourself an outline, even though you've written the book or the novella, and then you use the outline, put it on cards, and then put them on a wall, sometimes that helps because that forces you to abstract the words you've already written from the content of the words.
Greg.
Yeah, I'm loving all this craft discussion. I did want to ask you about influences a bit because I'd say the story reminded me of Ursula K. Le Guin. So I'm going to ask you who's influenced your writing. How did you develop your writing besides obviously writing and teaching, but did you have certain teachers, or was it certain books you read, or just sort of what was your journey towards becoming a writer?
You're right about Ursula, especially with this piece, because I was thinking about, as I was writing it, I was thinking about the Gospel of the Acacia Seeds or whatever it's called. You know, she had those extremely short animal things where she's forcing you to see, to observe the alienness of the animal, even as you are drawing conclusions from it. And she did that marvelously a number of times. I did study with her. I was lucky that way. And she was a really good instructor. But I think her writing, and especially some of her later stuff, became really important to me because she does, like any of the master writers when they are late in life, like Elmer Leonard's another example, um, they they feel the end coming and they become more and more the thing they are. So Le Guin became ever more stripped, ever more simple, ever more her already plain spoken prose became plainer spoken. Elmer Leonard, who always leaned in heavily in dialogue in his last mysteries became two lines to set up a scene, and then it's just strictly dialogue, not even attributes, just strictly dialogue, because that was his sweet spot. But I'd say I'm I'm not really influenced right now that much by modern writers, but I am very much influenced by just this sort of gorgeous writing that you get in the Victorian period, like Gibbon. You know, these impeccably complex sentences that you never lose your way, even though they are so insanely complicated. And that's my goal sometimes, is to just write a 200-word sentence that you never get lost in, which like John Collier does in his Monkey Wife. So, I guess that would be sort of Le Guin, and then Richard Adams for Watership Down, and then Patrick O'Brian became an enormous influence on me, because Patrick O'Brian is writing this dated voice, but it is so vivid and so lusciously complex, and also all over the map. It moves from high comedy to deep tragedy. It buries the lead. He starts entire books like in the aftermath of what would be the climax of somebody else's book. So they're just genius. And I read him there are 21 books. I read them probably 5 times in a row while I was trying to figure out what he did, because it's almost impossible to describe, because it's so multifarious.
Edgar.
Hi. Considering all the stories from you that I've read, Mantis Wives seems to be the most demanding for the reader. And I was thinking if that made you receive interesting stories from readers' reactions to this story that you would like to uh, tell us.
Well, I think that I didn't get a lot of feedback on this one. I did on some of the other stuff, like Spar. I got a lot of feedback. Ponies, I got a lot of feedback. Then like 26 Monkeys, I still get feedback on that. But in this case, I think people, honestly, it's meant to be so estranging and unsettling, that I think people didn't want to say anything because they were afraid that they'd be wrong. But there is, in fact, no wrong way to read a story. There's the way I thought it would be read, but if you read it, reader response is ultimately each reader defines for themselves what a story is about, and it's based on a lot of things I have no control over. So I didn't get a lot because I think just a lot of people, when I did hear from people, they tended to comment on the beauty of the language. Um, uh, it's and actually, since then, I've gone way farther off the sort of beaten path. I had a collection come out in 2019, whenever it was, called The Privilege of the Happy Ending, which is where this was anthologized. And some of the stories are barely stories, because I was very interested in asking questions about estrangement, how short can a story be and have the reader still fall into it? What are the constraints of extreme language? And Privilege of the Happy Ending, actually, the most extreme stuff didn't even make it into it because it was stuff that was published in Diagram Magazine online, one of which is it's called An Attempted Exhausting Place in Paris by Georges Perec by Kij Johnson is the full title. And that was the Perec that I'm discussing is actually just a 70-page long list of things he noticed during 3 days on the specific square. And so it's just strictly what he notices. Things like my back is hurting. Oh, a truck went by. Oh, another truck went by. Oh, a girl walked by carrying a baguette. And I took that. So he was organizing all of that information sequentially. So this happened, then this, then this. And I was like, or what happens if you arrange it thematically? And so I took the entire list and I rearranged it and re-encapsulated it so that it's so like every time he discusses a car, I listed all the cars that he lists. Every time he talks about these are all the people in it. These were the dogs that were seen in it. So it was basically could not be more abstract from like what we would consider prose fiction. But it was part of this sort of process I've been going through of saying, okay, how do we break? We all think we know what narration is. We all know what narrative theory is, but to what extent can we break it? And what are the rewards if we break it? And also, what are the penalties? What do we have to counter if we want to be accessible, but also breaking these universal conventions? So it was a fun experiment. And now I'm going back to conventional storytelling because it was fun, but now I'm done.
We actually read Pamela Zolin's The Heat Death of the Universe several years ago because you had mentioned it in connection with 26 Monkeys.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. I was very much thinking of that because, the attempt, and I love Heat Death of the Universe because you're watching somebody in extremis trying to make sense of everything, and you get the numbering, and the numbering is part of her attempt. And that's where in 26 Monkeys, I was like, oh my goodness, yes. When people are in extremis, we do start like counting the number of steps. We start counting the number of times we brush our teeth because that keeps the brain slightly occupied, which helps us counter the sort of what we're trying to control. So it's a form of micro control over ourselves that we hope will help us manage the larger issues in our lives. So yeah, and I thought, Zolene, that is such a good story. It's so powerful.
All right, Greg, and we should probably make this our last question because we don't want to impinge too much. Greg.
Sorry, this is sort of off the wall, but I wanted to ask if you happen to know Dr. Maureen Honey, who taught English at the University of Nebraska until 2019. Anyway, she was my English professor
Oh,
at
nice.
Michigan State, but I just thought maybe you had been at a conference with her or something.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll wrap up with like if I was going to start reading some of your books, what would you recommend as where to start?
Well, if you're looking for longer works, I think the Dream Quest of Velvet Bow is a good starting thing. It's a novella. It's you don't have to know anything about Lovecraft. If you do know about Lovecraft, it is riddled with Easter eggs, but you don't have to know anything about Lovecraft. If you're and then after that, it's like I think Fudoki, which was which I wrote. It was when I was sort of exploring medieval Japan. So it's a very so it's a story set in medieval Japan, 1185, and it's dealing with an interesting time in their history. And the protagonist is a 70-year-old woman who is telling a story about, she's a princess, she's an empress, and she's telling a story about Japan, which, despite the fact she's a Japanese empress, she's never actually seen. So she's making it up while she is sort of unpacking her life and figuring out what it's, in some ways, it's quite literary because it's got that layered story arc, but it was really, I think it was like some of the best writing I've done. But the short story collection, Privilege of the Happy Ending, actually has Velvet Bow in it. So you can read that, and it's got like 3 novelettes, 2 novelettes and a novella, and then a whole bunch of other short stuff. And that's a pretty good way to get Velvet Bow. And it's slightly more cost effective than buying Velvet Bow and then buying something else. So
Awesome. All right. Well, this has been delightful, and I would like a show of jazz hands for Kij in
thank
of
you.
appreciation.
Thank you. This is a really fun, I mean, it's nice to talk to people who are interested in craft at a high level,
Yeah.
because, so much of your time you're like, well, here's what I meant. But being able to talk about the craft of writing with specific reference to something that you've all read is like a pretty special gift. So thank you for that very
Awesome.
much.
This has
Thank-
been spectacular. Like
It
I
has.
have loved every minute.
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad
Yes.
I have too. This was fantastic. And thank you, Kat, for inviting me because it's a delight. I'm glad we finally got to do it.
Yes.
Um,
Thank you so much.
yeah, you bet. Anybody who wants to reach me is welcome to do so. My email address is ultimately utterly findable, but it's kijjohnson@gmail.com. And just if you want to reach out, I'm more than happy to talk to people. So
Awesome. Let me quit. Hello, I am Kat Rambo. I am the person who runs the Rambo Academy for Wayward Writers. If you enjoyed this video, and if you are looking for an online community aimed at fantasy, science fiction, and horror writers, particularly one that includes not just a lively Discord server, but a bunch of events aimed at helping you refine your craft, well, look no further. Our weekly events include a motivation session on Mondays, Wednesday writing to prompts, and Friday chat and co-work. The monthly events are a short story discussion club, when this was an example of one in which we had Kij coming to talk about her excellent story in an illuminating way. Other people, our craft book discussion group also is talking right now about A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders, but we have other craft books that we have read, including Dawn Moss and Robin Laws. And occasionally we bring authors in. I bring authors in. I'm the only one doing it, really. Minister Faust has come and talked to us. Nisi Shaw, Nancy Kress, Elizabeth Bear. We had a great session with Isabel Kim, came and talked about why don't we just kill the kid in the Omelas hole. And then we also talked about the Le Guin story as well. So this is done through my Patreon. Please check it out if you're interested. If you're a member, you also get a discount on the online classes that I run. And I don't know, if you really liked this, I can promise you there are going to be more events like this, or at least I hope so. Thanks a lot.